in the philosophy literature more broadly and in the legal literature too, there is lots of stuff out there about things that happen in pregnancy, like abortion, birthing, those sorts of events. But there was a lot less actually about what pregnancy is, what gestation is, and what its implications are. And so I wanted to have a bit of a think about that.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Elizabeth Chloe Romanis. She is Associate Professor in Biolaw in the Durham Law School, as well as in the Durham Centre for Ethics and Law in the Life Sciences. And her work focuses on healthcare law and bioethics. Her books include Early Medical Abortion, Equality of Access, and the Telemedical Imperative with Jordan Parsons, and Biotechnology, Gestation, and the Law, which will be our focus for today. She also has a variety of published articles on these and related topics. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Romanis.
No, thank you so much. That was a great introduction, and thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, so as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your fairly recent book, Biotechnology, Gestation, and the Law. And before we get into some of the details, can you give a bit of an overview of this book? You know, what sort of issues to cover, who's it for, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the book basically is about gestation and technologies enabling gestation. So that's surrogacies, uterus transplantation, and ectogestation. So that's gestation facilitated by a machine. And really, I got the idea for this book like towards the end of my PhD. That was very much about artificial placentas and gestation outside the body. I sort of got to thinking that lots of the questions that are raised about this technology are also really broadly about other technologies too. And I also sort of was thinking that it was quite noticeable to me that there had been lots of discussion in the bioethics space about assisted conception, but not so much about assisted gestation. So that was interesting to me. And then also in the philosophy literature more broadly and in the legal literature too, there is lots of stuff out there about things that happen in pregnancy, like abortion, birthing, those sorts of events. But there was a lot less actually about what pregnancy is, what gestation is, and what its implications are. And so I wanted to have a bit of a think about that. So it's kind of a mishmash of ideas coming together, but really to look at what gestation is, and then what different technologies that change how it can happen mean, and then what sort of broad ethical legal issues do they raise? Yeah,
great. And yeah, you talked about gestation and pregnancy, and that's early on in the book, that's one of the distinctions you make. You try to point out that these aren't really the same thing, and you want to think a bit more carefully about them, and from a philosophical and from a legal perspective. So maybe talk about that a bit more, like what is the difference between pregnancy and gestation, and how is that like significant, do you think, especially in a legal sense?
Yeah, so the two terms are really used interchangeably. Like, you know, sometimes we talk about a gestator to mean a pregnant person. And, you know, sometimes we talk about weeks gestation instead of weeks pregnancy. Like the terms are just sort of used all the time as like they're interchangeable things, they're the same. And I guess like my thinking on this is also really framed by discussions I was having with a colleague, Victoria Adkins at Greenwich, where we thought about this in the context of neonatal intensive care and artificial placentas. But essentially the argument is this: gestation is a process in which a new human entity is formed. So it is the knitted together series of occurrences in which, you know, something goes from the very beginnings of an embryo all the way through to an entity that could survive birth in the vast majority of cases, and then make the adaptations necessary to live in the external environment. So we're talking about a really mature fetus. And so that's really a process. And pregnancy is more a state of being in which a body, a person, facilitates that process. And so the two things happen most of the time at the same time, right? You can't have a gestation without a pregnancy, or pregnancy without a gestation. It's seemingly that would make sense, except there are all sorts of natural occurrences where you get pregnancy without gestation. So sometimes you can have an ectopic pregnancy, for example, where the embryo hasn't implanted somewhere where a gestation could successfully occur, but that person is still, for all intents and purposes, pregnant. Um, there are things like gestational trophoblastic disease, also known as a molar pregnancy, where the body behaves as if pregnant, even though there is no fetus. There's only a cancerous tumor or a non-cancerous tumor. And then, really sad cases where a pregnancy is established and is developed over a period of time, and then unfortunately the fetus dies. Those are also cases where gestation ends, but the pregnancy continues. And then, in my area of interest, I came to this idea more from the other angle, that if ectogestation were ever to become possible, then you would have gestation without a pregnant person, and so gestation without pregnancy. And that seems to really show how different they are and raise some interesting questions for me about, how do we regulate gestation without pregnancy, when lots of my intuitions about regulating pregnancy, i.e. not doing that, are very much based on bodily autonomy considerations about pregnant persons and the people in the state of undertaking pregnancy. So I thought it raised an interesting idea to think about them slightly separately.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely makes sense. Is there something you wanted to add there? Yeah. I did want to, just a kind of more general question, like, I can understand how these terms, they could be conflated or maybe a bit imprecise. These terms and others as related. And when we try to give more precise or like rigorous accounts or definitions of them, like, is there a bit like to provide clearer boundaries? Is there a worry that there's sort of conceptual engineering going on here? Like, in other words, that we're not really clarifying how these terms are already used, but maybe like just offering a new way to use them that's maybe has sharper boundaries, but in general, just wasn't necessarily what we were saying before. Maybe I'm not phrasing this best way, but do you see what I'm getting at here?
I understand the question. It's an important one, and I think there are lots of places where, particularly at the beginning of life, there is some extent to which we are concept engineering, and I still think it's important that we do that, right? Because it's still useful in terms of separating out what questions we're actually asking about what, and in what circumstances. In this particular case, I just don't think that's true, though, in the sense that these are instances that we have taken to be coextensive, but they're actually very different things. And the conflation of them has led to some quite material harms, or at least could. So, for example, just one example might be abortion. Regulating abortion as the ending of a pregnancy has some very serious consequences, because we limit instances in which pregnancies can be ended in circumstances where that might not be appropriate, particularly if people might be against abortion on the grounds that it kills fetuses. There might be instances where we don't end a gestation, but we could end a pregnancy that they might be broadly in favour of. And so, I don't take that view. I don't think that's what's important. But sometimes there might be cases where we're almost mistaken about what it is that we are or aren't defending. And it can have some quite real world impacts, I think, particularly the regulation of abortion as the ending of a pregnancy, not the ending of a gestation, as just one example.
Right. Yeah, and there's a bunch of other things that will come up here. Yeah, so another thing that you explore relatively early on is the mereological relationships between the fetus and the pregnant person. So in particular, two common views might be, well, on the one hand, maybe the fetus is a part of the pregnant person, or maybe it's right to think of it as a separate entity contained inside the fetal containment model. I mean, can you talk a bit about the dispute there and which approach you prefer?
Yeah, so, these are positions that have been well established in metaphysics, but they were really new to me when I came to them during my PhD. So you have one view, basically the container model, and this is the sort of culturally assumed model in a lot of Western societies and high-income economies, essentially the idea that a fetus is just contained within a pregnant person and spoken about almost as if it's this completely distinct entity that just happens to be located within a pregnant person. And the opposite view, which comes out much more recently in its explicit form, primarily Elsling Kingma, is the major voice behind this idea. But it's essentially that it's wrong to think about a fetus as merely contained within a pregnant person. Rather, we should recognize it as a constituent part, exactly the same as all sorts of other bits of our bodies that help us do different things. A fetus is what makes a body a pregnant body. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, ranging from topological continuity to immunological tolerance, how the fetus is treated by the body as part of the body, it's tolerated well. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. I, in this book, explore both of these positions and then note that there are a couple of others as well. Those aren't just a binary. There are other views that people take, overlap, underlap, that sort of thing. I mean, Suki Finn offers a really good comprehensive exploration about all sorts of different ideas outside of this binary. But I explore those ideas a bit to say that I do take the parthood idea to be most persuasive to me. It sits well with my intuitions. But really what I outlined those things for was to say, well, this quite an interesting idea, like what a fetus is in relation to a pregnancy. And yet it's been a relatively underexplored phenomenon in legal circles, really, to think about what the law is actually saying about what a fetus is. So stepping backwards from the kind of practical problems law is solving to say, well, when the law intervenes in contexts like pregnancy loss, or to manage pregnancy loss remains, or to dictate where pregnancies can be ended, et cetera, what is it also saying about what that fetus is, and sort of what model of pregnancy is it subscribing to? And for me, that made for a really interesting investigation because I sort of found that the law in the jurisdiction in which I'm trained, so it's primarily England and Wales, the law is really unstable in terms of which view it adopts in different circumstances. And it is overwhelmingly what you would expect, the sort of container view, because that aligns with a lot of the sort of cultural assumptions that have been made today. But there are times where a parthood view is also adopted in certain areas of the law. And what I found to be the case, at least what I argue, is that I think that instability is really unhelpful because it doesn't allow for sort of a consistent, or at least a way that makes sense of having constant ethical, legal, political, social questions about pregnancy being approached consistently. But also, the inconsistency, I think, is often motivated by reaching certain answers. And the answers often work to the detriment of the needs of pregnant people. So sometimes when the fetus is recognised only as a part, that also has really damaging consequences for pregnant people who wanted it to be treated differently and so on. So in the context of how pregnancy remains are treated pre-24 weeks. So it was kind of an interesting investigation because I didn't think it had been done before. But just to look at what the law is saying in these practical contexts to see what it's actually saying about that metaphysical debate. I didn't think that investigation had happened yet.
Yeah, for sure. That's really interesting. Yeah. So I could see how, like, for the purposes of, better functioning law, it would make sense to not only reflect on what the commitments are and try to make it consistent, but actually, try to think about these things and get a sort of plausible assumptions into the law, so to speak. So, yeah, and I know you're speaking about this from legally speaking, from a England and Wales perspective, but presumably these legal issues come up in other places as well.
I would have loved to have had more time in this book to think a bit more about other jurisdictions and to bring those reflections into it. I think the idea of the investigation is something that I would like to see carried forward, like having more lawyers look at the law and see what the commitments it is making, like from a metaphysical perspective, are. Because I think it makes for a much better, more comprehensive understanding of why certain outcomes are being reached in different contexts.
Right. I did want to present about the parthood stuff. I did want to sort of briefly sketch out kind of the way I think about this. I have a kind of unorthodox view. Let's see what you think. So I think oftentimes, and this is a case like this, like mereological relationships can be, in some cases, kind of vague or indeterminate and can even come in degrees. So I'm thinking that, like, given the relevant sort of ambiguity in what counts as part of a person, I'm kind of inclined to say that, yeah, okay, at conception, I think it makes a lot of sense to say that the gestating thing is clearly part of the pregnant person. But I don't know, it gradually becomes more appropriate to consider it less of a part, sort of later on in gestation, typically later on in pregnancy, but without any sort of sharp boundaries along the way. So, yeah, I don't know. I haven't really said a lot here. I've sort of just briefly sketched the approach, but do you get the idea? What do you think about this kind of, kind of vague?
There are some people who take the view that, like, determining the relationship one way or the other is kind of the wrong way to go about it, when, like, it doesn't really seem like a static thing. Like, there seems to be a big difference between something at the beginning of pregnancy and at the end. I mean, I take a slightly different view because I am so persuaded by Kingma's account of, we need to look to a few things here, like how well is it tolerated immunologically, like how well does it function as part of the whole. There are a number of different criteria that she uses, and I think those things stay static even if the nature of the gestating entity, so the nature of the part, changes over time. And I think that happens with all sorts of different parts of ourselves, some which deteriorate faster than others, right? Depending on a particular condition, that what that thing is changes over time. So I think, like, some thinking about it broader just makes sense to me, like what the relationship is, and maybe it's not static, that's fine, but the nature of it fundamentally remaining, easier to describe in one way rather than the other. And I think, like, some of the sort of more gradualist accounts, underlying them somewhat is this idea of, like, at some point it will take a different form, and that it could be separated and form its own thing. And so it's sort of tempting to try and think about it differently. But for me, like, I don't know, the fact that it is more mature and it could be its own thing, or, it might have features that look more recognizable, or whatever it is, those things don't really change what it is now, for me. So I'm not sure that actually answered your direct point, but for me, I think, like, the mereological relationship might not be a static one in terms of what the entity looks like, but it is a static one in terms of how we can describe the relationship.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's sort of difficult. I guess, I don't know. I think I find something intuitive about the idea that, look, when we're considered whether something's the same person or a part of the same person, or a separate person, perhaps a separate thing. Although thing here, I mean, that can be a bit, well, I'm not going to get into that. When I consider an embryo or a fetus, in its 9th month of gestation, I don't know. I feel like there's something intuitive to say that that's kind of a separate thing inside, in a sense in which the other thing isn't. Maybe these other relationships are sort of constant throughout, even, but then the question is, are we tracking those other features that you discuss when we talk about, it was Kingma and Finn, I think that's who we were referencing. Are we tracking those other features when we, I'm talking about parts of people and so on? I don't know. It's not so obvious to me, but just my brief thoughts about it. I don't know if you want to say more about it.
I mean, Kingma, I understand the intuition, I really do, but, like, having read Kingma and Finn's work and some of Suki Finn's other work as well, and some of Elslyn Kingma's other work as well, like, my intuition is, like, totally flipped. So I have to say, like, this was my first foray into metaphysics, and their work really was a great guide. And when I read, different people who took very different views, so they took more a dyad approach or an overlapping approach or the container approach, I know there wasn't still an answer for me to these, like, very basic conditions of parthood that they had set out. And yeah, even if the embryo becomes mature fetus, in that process, it's still, having the same relationship with the pregnant person's body, even if, in form it looks different.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. And then, okay, I did want to move on.
We'll agree to disagree on this one, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done a lot of reading or thinking about this issue, so I guess I'll defer mostly. But yeah, that's my intuition anyway. Yeah, so we definitely should talk about a lot of the issues that come up with biotechnologies, and you talk about how they have the potential to really affect just the nature of gestation. And so getting into that, can you explain some of the ways in which these biotechnologies have or could affect gestation in significant ways, and maybe some examples of what sort of technologies you discuss?
Yeah. So I mean, we already have seen such wide like changes in reproductive revolutions, like with technology over time. Like, since the IVF in the 70s, we've had reproduction without sex, which at the time was like a mind-blowing idea. Now that's not so abnormal. But gestation and changing the modalities of that, for me, can do something that we maybe haven't gotten as comfortable discussing, because we've always thought of gestation is happening in this very particular way. So gestation is always facilitated by a pregnancy in the body of a person with physiology assigned female, so usually women, right? But what I think new technologies are able to do that transcend that are really exciting. So uterus transplantation is a technology that at the moment has only been offered to cis women to enable them to carry pregnancies when they otherwise don't have a uterus. So maybe they had one and they lost it to a hysterectomy, or they were born without one because of a congenital malformation or something similar. So that technology has been amazing for people who want to experience a pregnancy. What I was really interested in this book is the way in which a transplant of a uterus could do something really like game-changing in terms of taking gestation into a place that we've never seen it before. So what would gestation in bodies assigned male look like? Now, that might be trans women who want to experience pregnancy, but it also could be gestation sustained by cis men, really opening up who does the work at the beginning of life, right, to bring new human entities into existence. So I thought that made for some really interesting, like, socio-political type questions available, like about who's responsible for that work and in what circumstances, and then what are the broader implications going to be. And then artificial placentas also raise some really interesting, exciting ideas, because they can not just take gestation into new kinds of bodies, they can take gestation entirely outside of bodies. So that's like the complete outsourcing of this technology, which again raises some really big questions. So, like, in what circumstances do we want to do that? What are the implications? What does it mean in terms of like how we relate to each other and how we become and things? So I think those two ideas, like gestation in new bodies and gestation beyond bodies, was really what I was trying to focus on in the book.
Yeah, some interesting stuff there. Like, So an important thing that comes up with these, as you discuss, is that, like, these biotechnologies invite sort of complicated ethical and legal issues, including as it relates to, like, rights, issues of access, justice, how these things are perceived socially, and so on. How do you want to perceive these, like, approach these complex issues, especially as the technologies and society might develop in unforeseen ways?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is just, like, I do think speculation is important. Like, the fact that, like, we're having a conversation about this now, before uterus transplantation is being permitted in bodies assigned male at birth, before we have a working model of an artificial placenta to replace NICU, never mind the idea of growing babies from scratch. To me, those are really important things, because this might be a speculative conversation, but thinking about the normative, ethical, legal questions that underlie uses of these technologies is really useful. Both in terms of, if this technology were to suddenly become available in the next few years, we'd have some ideas about what the questions are and what the different sides of the arguments might be. But then also, for me, sometimes I think that speculating about technologies can really force us to do some conceptual work about what we're working with now as well. Like, I think, at least for me, if I had never been working on artificial placentas, artificial wombs, and what their implications were, I never would have got to thinking about whether gestation and pregnancy were the same thing. So, like, sometimes I think thinking about new technologies can also shed light on what's going on right now. And sometimes that's raising new conceptual clarities. Sometimes that's also just shining a light on issues that are already social justice issues in a more stark light, like thinking about access to artificial placentas in a world where maternal mortality is rising amongst marginalized groups. I think makes for a really important interrogation on the social nature of reproductive technologies and who they're accessible to, alongside, general analysis of healthcare disparities. So I think for me, like at the core of all of this is speculation is super valuable as like a method in ethics and law, and thinking about new ideas and new technologies and things like that is really important, both in a what happens if this happens tomorrow sense, but then also in a how it can help us to think better about today sense.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Like we want to sort of think ahead about how and be prepared for changes, in technology and so on that might come. And as you say, it can help us also think clear about these issues today as well. And as you sort of said already, one of the potential technologies that comes up has the potential to, you talk about this, like unsexing procreative capacities. With uterus transplants and so on. And I don't know if you want to talk a little more about this or more generally, but how technologies like this, well, you might think, well, that's just got to be it's something that can be helpful. It's got to be a good thing. But sometimes there could be downsides to technologies like that or others. So I don't know if you want to talk about that more and some of the positives and potential negatives of technologies like that.
Yeah. I mean, so I would say like uterus transplants and ectogestation, I mean, there's so much debate about whether they are good or bad things. And one of the commitments I've made in this book is that like a lot of the time, whether you think one way or the other about a technology will come down fundamentally to how valuable you think pregnancy is. And I've tried to stay, I wouldn't say neutral on the issue, because it's not like I don't have an opinion, right? I think it's wrong to say that. But it's more that I made a commitment to diversity of experience and why people might value different experiences for cultural reasons, for personal reasons, and so on and so forth. So like one of the best things about both of these technologies is what they can offer to people in terms of experience. So both are potentially helping people to have babies where they want them and they otherwise might not be able to, for example. But uterus transplant, whether we're talking about it in the conventional sense of, the way it's been used so far is it's treatment for women who've lost their uterus or don't have one, or whether we're talking about it in the like unsexing capacity, where we're talking about access for people with physiology assigned male at birth or cis men, that is offering somebody the experience of pregnancy where their other alternatives to becoming a parent meant that they didn't get that 9 months bodily experience of generative work. And if that's something they really value, then that could be amazing for them, like both in terms of their how they see themselves, their identity, like and also their relationship with their future child potentially. The downside to that is that if we help people to have that experience, some people say that we run the risk of like effectively overvaluing pregnancy and perpetuating notions of pronatalism that are also like progestationalism in a sense, where we say like relationships with children are only valuable where gestation was involved, or there's something so special about pregnancy that other types of becoming a parent aren't as important. So like I guess they're like sort of social narrative arguments. We're weighing up what individuals value against what it signals when we allow people to make those choices. The ectogestation debate is like almost the same but opposite, right? And I guess this is why I thought it was useful to think about these technologies together, is ectogestation, were we to get to the point where we could grow babies from scratch, people who hate the idea of pregnancy, they hate the idea of having to use their body to make a baby, but they really want to be a parent, that technology offers them the ability to do that without having to have the bodily experience. And that might speak to their values and their idea of what their bodies are for, what their identity is, and so on and so forth. But then, on the flip side of that are the social narrative concerns about devaluing pregnancy, and what are we saying about people who want to be pregnant, and the social consequences of the decision to be pregnant, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a big question in here about procreative experience and how it relates to individual identity and preferences, and then what the upshot is of individual values and narratives and experience. And I guess I tried in my book to think about ways we can make space for all sorts of individual values and all sorts of reasons why people want to become pregnant or don't, but they would still want babies. And I guess it's kind of a tricky thing to do because those narratives do exist already in a world where we don't have these options. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is complicated stuff. I was thinking I don't know, when we talk about those narratives and other sort of social effects and how these things are perceived and such, I mean, this is largely just, it doesn't have to be that way, right? We could try to improve the way things are perceived so as to be less harmful or to make these things more acceptable and avoid some of these potentially harmful narratives and so on. To what extent do you think that maybe that is the way to go, try to get some, social reform or something there to, avoid some of the concerns you raised there, or is it just sort of unavoidable?
Yeah, I guess this is one of the key things I was trying to argue. So I think we do need quite a lot of social reform before these technologies can exist in the way that they could, before we can imagine them as procreative choices effectively, because I do think at the moment, were these technologies to sort of come into the world that we live in, I think some of this social narrative stuff is inevitable. I mean, there is already a sense of damned if you do, damned if you don't, with all sorts of different pregnancy decision making. Even something as simple as how to give birth, that's really intuitively a lot of people would think was an individual preference and about values and so on and so forth. There is still a lot of judgment for different choice making. In the country in which I live, in the UK, people who seek out cesarean section for personal reasons are often shamed as being too posh to push. Simultaneously, people who want to give birth at home are often shamed for putting their babies at risk when, there's limited evidence of that, but they're shamed as, for lacking some kind of responsibility in the circumstance or whatever. So I think at the moment, in the way that people feel so, society feels so empowered to reflect on individual value in procreative decision making in lots of ways, then I could see these narratives playing out always to the detriment of people who could experience pregnancy in lots of different ways. I could see people talking about active gestation as, you're just being lazy, right? And I could see people talking about uterus transplantation as, you're doing something medically dangerous when actually it's just an experience and, you could do other things. So I think until we are in a place where there is a lot less shame directed from social institutions towards primarily women who need to make procreative choices, I really worry about the development of these technologies and the impact that they will have on people, in terms of how they're building their families. That said, I do, there's a lot of optimism in my book too, right? In the sense that I think that there is a lot of equality enhancing potential behind these technologies. So lots of scholars think about that in a gender dimension. I personally don't think that's where the equality enhancing potential comes from. What I think these technologies could do, though, is for lots of people who experience involuntary childlessness right now for a variety of reasons, for gestation-related reasons. So say male same-sex couples, or, couples where they're experiencing unexplained infertility related to pregnancy, those sorts of families would be able to better build their families with, less, or no, just they would be able to do it. And they might be able to do that in ways that speak to their values about pregnancy. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't think these technologies are innately bad things. I just don't think their potential is quite as good as it might initially seem, if there isn't the kind of social reform that we should hope for.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then without social reform, as these technologies develop and come about, I mean, maybe we have to think about the trade-offs. Maybe it's still worth it to enable, access to these technologies, even if there's some cost in some cases about, feeding into these narratives and shame and other worries. But maybe it can be worth it in some cases, maybe not. It's sort of difficult to decide in general, I guess. But
yeah, and I think that would be very context specific, and also jurisdiction specific as well. I find the ideas of these technologies much much more palatable and much more yay, these could do amazing things when I am from a jurisdiction where we have healthcare free at the point of access, and we do sometimes, not enough, but we do sometimes fund reproductive technologies. So I find the other sort of idea of technologies in systems where healthcare is not free a little bit more concerning, because you can imagine, right, ectogestation being a serious problem in a country where healthcare isn't free and very rich people are able to outsource their gestation entirely, and then poorer people don't have a choice about pregnancy or not. And all of that against the context that maternal mortality is rising, globally, right, in all sorts of high income economies. So I think there's that dimension to it as well, the socioeconomics of it. And I mean, that's still true here in the UK, where I said we only fund reproductive technology sometimes. A lot of where we do fund technology is very limited to biological ideas about where technology is necessary. So, it might not be as readily available as I'm imagining in the best case scenario as well. But I think that socioeconomic, class, finance dimension of these things is also really important to think about.
For sure. I do want to bring up something that comes up at several points throughout the book, which is issues relating to biological essentialism. And for our purposes here, it's kind of roughly the view that reproduction is solely a matter of biology and can't change. And you argue that this is not only false, because it can involve more than just biology and can change and so on, but also potentially harmful in various ways. This is, of course, a large topic, and I don't expect you to cover everything here, but I don't know, could you talk a bit about biological essentialism, why you reject it, why it can be harmful?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that biology determines what we are and what we can be, I find to be quite flawed in a lot of contexts, just because everything is refracted through social experience and human experience more broadly, right? Everything's interpreted. So the idea that biology is inviolable or this is the only way in which babies are made or whatever, I do reject, in the sense that we've always been a procreative or creative procreative people, right? There are always ways in which we're circumventing what we know to be possible. And that's happened since the beginning of time, in the sense that, people don't always raise the babies that are genetically their babies. Surrogacy and other reproductive revolutions like IVF have changed ideas about who's responsible for baby making and what kind of babies we can make. The idea that you experience involuntary childlessness and then that's it is just not something that we accept anymore, right? It just constantly changes. And I think the technologies I'm talking about are really just the next step in this. So assisted conception has already been an intervention into biological essentialism to some extent, right? You can argue that it also does a lot to reify it as well, right? In the sense that there are people who seek out their own genetically related children when they could pursue other alternatives to parenthood. But I guess what I'm sort of getting at is that I think we should see what we've always thought of as the biological realities of reproduction as constantly subject to change. There are always new technologies in development that change what we take to be the fundamental premises of a successful reproduction in a literal technical sense. But then the other thing I'm sort of getting at is that one of the problems in regulation is that we make assumptions about biology too readily in order to do all sorts of things. So I talked about it in relation to parenthood, for example. Like there are some scholars who reject the idea of surrogacy on the grounds that, it's biological essentialism to favour genetics over pregnancy, for example, and they say, we need to reject biological essentialism. And all I've said really is that that's reframing biological essentialism and just replacing genetics with gestation. So I think that there are also other contexts, where we say that the person who contributed genetic material is more important than a person who's done. There's all sorts of things going on here that are just normative values that are attached to biology that we need to sit back and question. And the law in England has gone some way with assisted reproduction to say, parenthood's actually a bit more of an intention thing, except when it comes to gestation. So there's been like some progress away from genetics, which I think is probably a good thing, to like reflect different values that are going on here and how people are wanting to make children, like use donors, etc., etc. But there's still some biological essentialism at the root of it, because who can access reproductive technologies is still framed through this idea of, what biologically means that you need it. So, yeah, there's sort of a lot going on. Like biological essentialism, you're right, comes up in quite a few places. But it is sort of an idea I wanted to bring to the forefront in relation to gestation as well as conception, because we've been having those conversations for a while now. And I thought it was also relevant to thinking about how babies come into existence, not just, what babies. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I like that. It's good to at least recognize and then potentially correct for a lot of these sort of normative assumptions that slip in, given these, assumptions of biological essentialism or things that might assume something like that. Yeah, because those things can be harmful or just wrong.
Yeah. And even when we think we've rejected biological essentialism sometimes, like we're still doing it. Like, saying, that genetics don't matter as much in this day and age. Well, yeah, we are making some progress with that, but we still really are, at least in this jurisdiction, very heavily focused on who does the pregnancy work, and that person is always the mother. So there's still a lot of biological essentialism at play there. So yeah, I think like there are so many different layers of it in reproduction, probably related to what you were saying, and this idea that like pregnancies have always happened and always need to happen to make babies in the world we live in right now. But we can ask some really interesting questions about what we're normatively assuming, for example, in a legal context, because we're taking that to be true. And so, yeah, introducing some new technologies into the mix and asking what they tell us, I think can help reveal some of that normative assumption making that's going on.
For sure. And you mentioned something else you discussed in the book having to do with like legal parenthood and stuff and the relationship between that and gestation, especially with motherhood. So you talk about in England, for example, the idea is that, okay, the person who facilitates gestation by sustaining a pregnancy, that's the legal mother. And I mean, as a general rule, that may seem kind of intuitive, sort of sensible, but you identify and discuss several issues with that approach. Do you mind kind of discussing some of these issues, maybe?
Yeah. So like you're quite right. As a general rule, it makes sense. Like, and as a general rule, most people aren't going to argue with it, right? But there have been a couple of places recently where like it has become a real issue in this jurisdiction. I mean, first and foremost, in cases where people have a gender recognition certificate. So that means that they are, for the purposes of English law, legally a man. And then they've been labelled a legal mother when they've given birth. And so they've challenged that on the grounds that, it's cis heteronormative to say I'm a mother, right? Like, I mean, they're not challenging the idea of gestational essentialism there. They're saying, I recognise I'm this child's parent. I just want to be described in terms that match my experience. So there is something there about like the language being problematic in terms of how gendered and sexed it is, and how that's not meeting the needs of every birth giver, who wants to be described in a different way. But there are some gestational essentialism elements to it as well that I find really problematic. The reason why I agree why in most instances it's not going to be a problem is because most people who undertake pregnancy do so intending to become a parent. And it's where intention aligns with the biological work that someone's doing that it makes sense to me. But there are cases where people do undertake pregnancy where they don't intend to be a parent. And in those cases, they're trying to do generative work, but they don't want the legal consequences of a parental relationship post-birth. And so like cases like surrogacy, so, say my sister couldn't sustain a pregnancy, and so I decided to do that work for her, or cases like adoption where somebody, maybe they realize they were pregnant and then they don't want to be pregnant, but they don't want an abortion. Like they think adoption is the option for them. In those cases in England, that individual will always have been the legal mother. They can sign away their parental rights at 6 weeks post-birth, but no other individual can then be called the legal mother because they didn't birth. And so there's something going on there about saying that this is the particular special relationship and only this person can do that. And it hurts two people. It hurts the people who don't want to be legal mothers who birth give, because you're it's like a form of conscription almost, where, you're saying that your intention is irrelevant because the biological work you have done is determinative. End of, right? People aren't given a choice. And I find that really weird when you think about things like sperm donors. Like we allow sperm donors or egg donors as well to say, they've done something, they've donated biological material, they've done some generative work, but they're entitled to a say about what that means. And we don't afford that to people who effectively want to be like gestation donors. So I find that really strange. It's a sort of conscripting thing. And then the second element is I think it also really hurts people who want to be called mothers who don't birth, right? So like people who adopt and the gendered language is really important to them. Like their motherhood doesn't seem any less than to me just because they didn't do the pregnancy. So I think like the gestational essentialism at work here, I think is just a bit outdated. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is that lots of the defenses of legal motherhood is the person who births is related to the idea that this has always been the law. And I just sort of thought, well, like, has it? And why has it always been the law? And has the meaning of that changed over time? Like, so I think it's what has probably once was correcting a historical injustice, because it used to be the case, back in the Victorian times, that if a woman got a divorce from her husband, then she lost custody of her children. She had no claim to them, right? So legal motherhood probably did a lot of heavy lifting to help women change their circumstance in terms of their relationship to their children at a particular point in history. But my argument sort of is that socio-political conditions are very different now, and we need to be moving towards a model of thinking about parenthood that's a lot more about intention. And that can be that biological work and intention often marry up, right? That's the reason why a lot of people are willing to do those things. But there are cases where they don't. And we need to get better at respecting people who undertake gestation. And one of the ways to do that is to say, your intention matters. And if you don't consider yourself the legal mother of this child, then you won't be. That's a very long-winded answer.
No, that's great. And yeah, and it sort of also invites the question, like in the case of ectogestation, like, okay, if there's no pregnant person, then is there no mother? Like necessarily? It seems like a weird consequence of that account of legal motherhood.
I mean, that is the law now. Like, and we would have, if there's no legal mother, there's also no legal father or second female parent. Like the law, like ascribes relationships based on that gestation element first and foremost. So yeah, there is no answer to that question, which again, I think poses a real problem, because even though this technology doesn't exist right now, the fact that we can't answer that question to me is concerning. Like, what account of parenthood is there if the gestation element is removed?
Right. Yeah. And we really should have one, at least in principle. Yeah. Yeah. So I did want to ask, I mean, you brought this up briefly, but I did want to ask a couple questions about the connection between sort of relevant biotechnologies and abortion. And you ultimately conclude that they don't really have any bearing at all on the morality of abortion. But people might find this pretty surprising, though. I mean, for example, as an example you discussed, we might think that if there is easy access to reliable ectogestation, that might at least render abortion less justifiable in many cases. Or maybe if there are technologies which make gestation significantly easier on a pregnant person, again, maybe that would make abortion less justifiable, since the cost of continuing pregnancy is less. Well, I mean, maybe talk briefly about these responses and why you don't accept it.
Yeah, so I guess, like, first and foremost, I think that abortion is, I think it encompasses various things. I think, like, I do think of it as a right to bodily integrity, at which point no new technology, even no matter how much it minimizes the experience of pregnancy in whatever imaginable world, how difficult that is for an individual. My thought is that anything that is a bodily condition to which an individual is not consenting is still a wrong, right? At a fundamental level, when it comes to the bodily integrity element. But there are also the other elements of abortion that we don't talk about quite as much, even though they're still important. So, there is an element to which people talk about abortion as a right to reproductive autonomy, which is sort of gendered in nature because the vast majority of people who can become pregnant are women. But given the consequences of reproducing for women is just so different to the vast majority of men, there is a strong argument that lots of scholars have made that also has to be really determinative in cases of unwanted pregnancy. And then finally, another thing that I just don't think we talk about much is almost like abortion as a right to equality in a very fundamental sense. Like, it's very hard to imagine how people who can become pregnant, primarily women, can engage on equal terms in society with other people if they don't have a right to have an abortion if that's what they so choose, because they're just not afforded the freedom to imagine their own body as theirs and to make whatever choices they want to do, engaging in society and engaging with other people. So for me, those three things encompass why abortion is so important. It protects people's bodily integrity, protects reproductive autonomy, that's especially important for women, and it recognises this sort of substance equality claim, that without it, you treat a whole class of people like second-class citizens. And so the development of any technology, no matter how maximal the impact it is on minimizing pregnancy obligations on individuals, to me, don't do away with any of those three things. And so that's sort of the point I was making, is like, I don't think it changes anything materially. But even if it did, I think it's very hard to say that these technologies do really change anything to that maximal extent. Like, the idea of artificial placenta is great, but if you're talking about it in place of abortion, you still have to extract an entity from a pregnant person's body to put it in a machine. And that's no small feat, right? And sometimes in the literature, it's talked about like a minor inconvenience when it's a surgical extraction of a part of oneself. That's major surgery. And so, like, I do think some of the imagining that's going on here is a problem, because it's creating a form of abstraction that, it is just too far. And I know I've defended speculating and being all fun about it, but it's just too far from the substance of the problem, which is unwanted pregnancy as a bodily experience. But it's a bodily experience with those other dimensions that I talked about built in. And so, yeah, I guess the point I was trying to make really was that the technologies don't change the fundamental thing at work here, which is unwanted pregnancy and all the dimensions that it encompasses. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm definitely mostly on the same page. I don't want to talk too much about abortion on its own, but like, I don't know. I mean, the stuff you brought up about autonomy and those rights and access and so on, I think is very important. Of course, we might also think that there are other values and other issues at play as well that, could potentially come in conflict, just like, well, the value of the developing individual, maybe the value of their potential future experiences and so on. how these
Totally
things
agree. For me, the reason where the places where those values get exciting is when we're not actually talking about abortion, right? When we're not talking about somebody's body, but instead, like, let's imagine you have an entity gestating in an artificial placenta, and you have two people who say, you know, this was our combined project, but one of them withdraws their permission. They don't want to be a parent anymore. That's quite an interesting problem, because without the sort of bodily dimension to it, without it actually being abortion that we're talking about, there is space there for the kinds of value discussions you're talking about. Like, do we value someone's right to become a parent more than their right not to be in that circumstance where we're not talking about bodily work anymore? And I think there are some really interesting conversations that can be had. I do totally agree with you. I just think it's like not the abortion context where those things can play out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I might think that it's still, again, this is good. Maybe it's just going to come down to how we weigh these separate values having to do with, the stuff that comes up in just like pregnancy and well, the values of the individual and their future experience and stuff. You might think that it's the stuff that you discussed is always going to sort of take precedence there. But I don't know. It's not as obvious to me. But I did want to say that, just going back to the sort of intuitions that I was sketching earlier, like, even if we think that in all these cases, sort of like the freedoms and the bodily rights and so on of the pregnant person would take precedence, maybe there's still a sense in which, like, if the technologies and such make things like ectogestation or pregnancy much easier, not to speculate too much, that would at least seem to me to make it maybe less warranted or less justifiable, even if we think that, okay, this person might still have the right, or still okay for them to end up terminate a pregnancy in that way. I don't know. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I do. And I think sort of for me, I would still think that there was still justification in whatever reason was given there, because, people need abortions for a wide variety of social, political reasons. And, I wouldn't want to start speculating about which ones are better and which ones are not. But what I think is really interesting in what you said is that, like, even if we were to take the position that there was some, difference in some of these cases sometimes, I think it's really important that the law doesn't take that stance, right? Because we're already seeing in lots of jurisdictions, in my personal view, an over-regulation of abortion that's resulting in some really concerning outcomes. Like, even in a jurisdiction like the UK, where abortion is readily accessible, there are still circumstances where people are facing criminal consequences for accessing abortion or having abortions. And so I think, like, there is a difference between what we would say, maybe is a morally better or morally worse abortion, and then the law making those determinations. So I think that's really important. I think for me, that, like, qualifying abortions as which ones are more right than others is never going to come to anything useful, because unwanted experience is an epistemologically transformative experience, and individuals in that circumstance who are experiencing the difficulty of that and have their reasons for abortion, I think that's a case where I would say we would be led by individuals who have that experience. And so, like, for me, I think the debate's not really worth having, but it's also not something that I think the law should have a say in anyway.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And earlier on, we talked about the mereological relationships between a fetus and a pregnant person, and this came up in the book here as well, about as it relates to abortion. So maybe could you talk a little bit about how that dispute might be relevant in discussions about abortion?
Yeah, I think, like, to be honest, it all depends on who you're speaking to, because I do think, like, the metaphysics way of thinking about what's going on in abortion can still be used by different sides of the argument in different ways. So, a part of a pregnant person, or merely contained within a pregnant person, it kind of makes no difference to the arguments I've set out about about the circumstances in which abortion is permissible, and the fact that it's readily, in my view, readily morally permissible. That said, maybe there is something to be said for the fact that I do take the view that it is a part of a pregnant person. And as a consequence, it's individuals making choices about themselves. That seems to be like a really individual thing to me. And then maybe that's why my intuition aligns so much more nicely with these sorts of ways of thinking that are very much like about the self and self-preservation and so on and so forth. I mean, I do also sometimes think that the metaphysical thing, it doesn't directly correlate to moral outcomes, because different people might impose different things on that. Like, somebody who was anti-abortion, for example, might think that the fetal parthood model still worked in their favour because they could argue that maintaining a pregnancy was also a form of self-care, or so on and so forth, right? Like, so I do think, in my view, my intuitions about the metaphysical relationship also align quite nicely with how I think about abortion. I think they intuitively align. But a lot of the people who spend more time arguing about metaphysical relationships between fetus and pregnant person than me are very keen to say, well, metaphysical relationship doesn't determine moral status, doesn't determine, ethical obligations in different circumstances. It's more a case of like debating what is, and then, you might think differently about what is when you bring that into sort of the ethical arena.
With all these issues you discuss about abortion, how do you think the laws might be improved, at least in the UK, to address some of the concerns that you discuss here?
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the major concerns that a lot of people have is that with the development of technology like ectogestation, ideas about fetal viability start to change, and then like thresholds for lawful abortion just sort of naturally fall. And that was more of a concern for me, for example, when we were talking about Roe era America, when fetal viability was like baked into the right to abortion. So it was until this point of fetal viability. And that was defined in a way where something like an artificial placenta, an artificial womb would come to limit abortion rights in the way that the law was written in that sort of federal sense. In the UK, the law is actually slightly more, it's slightly better done in the preserving abortion access sense, because the legal standard isn't viability, it's capacity to be born alive, in terms of the later term abortions and how that's described in the law. Also, the legal framework is set up in such a way where abortion is a crime, but then it isn't, so that the actus reus element is amended to say it's not a crime in these circumstances. And the circumstances in which abortion is lawful are broad enough that even if this technology were come into existence tomorrow, the law would still allow for abortion up to 24 weeks on quite broad socio-medical grounds. There are still some challenges embedded in the law in different places, though. Like, we do have conscientious objection in English law, and, some people would think that was really important to protect the autonomy of healthcare professionals. I take a slightly different view, but that's a long, different story, isn't it? But though there's a challenge in there, because what if the medical profession start interpreting the law in a different way because of, a sort of conscientious objection type way of thinking? I think there is also the risk, and this has happened a number of times, where the technology is introduced and then the law might allow it now, but then that might inspire changes to the law, right, to lower the abortion threshold. And in my general view, and I didn't get as much time to explore it in the book as I wanted to, but viability is a really bad way to determine permissibility of abortion access, because in my view, viability is a standard that helps us to determine which premature babies get treatment, right? Because wouldn't be exposing them to additional harms and suffering with limited possibility of a good outcome. viability tells us that, we're treating babies where there is a possibility of a good outcome, right? So using that concept to determine which pregnancy should end or could end is, in my view, problematic. And there is the risk with ectogestation that notion that is already in the law in quite a lot of places is sort of cemented and embedded, and then becomes a sort of form of additional restriction. But to me, very different philosophical as well as sort of clinical decision. What baby should we treat in NICU versus what pregnancy should be allowed to end? That's a very different question to me. So using that notion of viability to limit pregnancy endings and limit access to abortion doesn't really make much sense to me. And I would worry about those thresholds if this technology came into being.
Yeah. I guess I don't have much to add there. Yeah, very good. Let's see. I had a couple more questions, and maybe we can wrap up if that's good with you. Yeah, so I don't know if there's anything that we haven't talked about in the book that you want to discuss briefly. Is there anything comes to mind?
Maybe one thing I'll talk about is a little bit about why it's useful to talk about these technologies together. There's this idea, it sort of came up at the end of my PhD. It was in the conclusion of my PhD thesis that maybe if we're going to talk about ectogestation, we should also talk about uterus transplants, and we should also talk about surrogacy sort of together. And then I did publish a paper, sort of a position paper, saying I think we should do this because there's overlapping issues. And it got a sort of mixed response. Some people were like, yeah, this makes sense. And then some people were like, no, it really doesn't, because surrogacy, for example, has more in common with questions about organ donation than it does questions about ectogestation and so on and so forth. And so I did in this book take the time. I really got deep into taxonomy and zoology in a way that I never thought I would. But one of the things that I really enjoyed doing, and I hope is quite useful to people interested in researching this area, is thinking about classification. These technologies, in my view, were really helpful to think about together, because the central point of them all is to help people who can't gestate or don't want to have that process in some way facilitated in a way that spoke to their values, whether that's them doing it themselves, the donated uterus, or somebody else doing it for them, surrogacy, or a machine doing it for them, ectogestation. But there's still something that relates all of these technologies together. So I undertook this sort of classification analysis to say, this technologies enabling gestation, they're this group of things. And if we think about them like a genus of technology, we can say that they're similar in these ways, but then maybe some of them are different species because they have these differences. And so thinking about the similarities and the differences between the technologies really helped highlight some of the interesting dimensions of them for me, ways in which they are useful to some people and not useful to others because of the things that they do, I think was really interesting. And I also got to thinking about technologies that I thought weren't technologies enabling gestation, even if they might look like it from the outside. So reciprocal IVF is something that I think is a great idea for people who think that it speaks to their procreative experience or makes it better. It's a form of, it's IVF. But when the fertilized egg needs to mature, that can happen sort of in a device that can be inserted into the vagina. And so some people might think of that as a technology enabling gestation because it's sort of an incubation period, which helps the embryo to develop, et cetera, et cetera. But my view was that this wasn't a form of technology enabling gestation because there was no implantation, so there was no state of pregnancy, which I think it was kind of an interesting dimension for me to explore. I thought thinking about what counted and what didn't, and how these technologies related to each other.
I did want to ask, with all the stuff about just biotechnologies and the law, how would someone actually go about trying to affect the law in light of some of these concerns that you bring up? How does it become actionable, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If anyone figures out the answer to that, it would be great if they could let me know. But yeah, I do think sort of when it comes to things that are so speculative, we need to start having the conversations now, but they're going to be more academic because that regulators who are dealing with more pressing, more immediate challenges don't have the time to be dealing with the speculative stuff as much. But that's why I sort of think the academic reflection is important, because when they do have the time, those of us who are in this space will have had the time and space to have done our thinking, and then we can contribute something. I mean, we do have regulators in the UK who do have like a horizon scanning function. So they are interested in what's coming, not just what's happening. And so there is the hope that that sort of horizon scanning function will eventually start to capture some of these technologies. But I mean, lots of the problems I talked about in this book, I didn't talk about surrogacy as much because it's a contemporary technology, but those surrogacy problems are happening now. And it's relatively slow waiting for law reform on those points. So, I guess what I'm saying is that like it's an academic conversation now, but my hope is that it becomes a regulatory conversation in the not too distant future, like ahead of technology. One of the biggest concerns that those of us who work on emerging biotech, whether that's in the reproduction space or something else, have, is that often we see regulatory responses to new technologies being very sharp, whether they're motivated by over-enthusiasm, but more often like things like fear. And science moves quickly. And if we don't spend time like doing the ethical and the legal sort of analysis of technologies before they're with us, the likelihood of a regulatory response being much harsher or less careful than it needs to be is much higher, I think.
Yeah. I mean, just, I guess, hopefully as the technology, but also the discourse surrounding these technologies and such develops, people working in law or having influence on law will at least take note. But yeah. Yeah. So I typically end with a kind of more meta-philosophical question. So what do you think is the value of philosophy? I know it's a big question, but why is philosophy worth doing, maybe to you or more generally? And maybe if you can talk about the value of philosophy, as it relates to some of the legal, social, and ethical issues like those you discussed in the book.
That's such a great question. I feel like I came to philosophy quite late. My PhD was actually in bioethics and medical jurisprudence, but I was planning to trick the system and go full law. But my PhD supervisor really gave me the confidence to start engaging in philosophy. And by doing that, I sort of realized that it's very hard to do law well without being skilled in, sort of the argumentation element of, not argumentation, but the sort of concept analysis that I've really gained from philosophy. And some of that is like metaphysics, some of that is like a lot more like ethical theory, but all of those things were underlining the way I was thinking about things. I just wasn't making them explicit. So I am really grateful to one of my PhD supervisors for giving me the confidence to engage with this stuff. And then I really got a crash course when I was able to spend a year at Harvard writing this book in an ethics centre where most people were philosophers. And a lot of them encouraged me to sort of engage with the more philosophical dimensions of my work. And I think that that's only enhanced the argumentation, both in terms of the concept analysis I've been able to do, thinking a bit more in depth about social and ethical implications. But also, I think, as well, like in a cynical sense as a lawyer, like whilst I've written from one jurisdiction, the approach has been a lot more legal theory and a lot more transdisciplinary than I anticipated. And so I do kind of hope that the insights from my book are relevant to other jurisdictions, like not just the one in which I'm trained. So I think philosophy has been really great for giving me the confidence to argue, but also giving me the confidence to stop and pause and think and ask questions about the concepts I'm using and what they mean in a way that I wasn't doing before. Hopefully that's a good answer.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Yeah, I think the question's there, and Oh, by the way, I'll include links in the description to where people can, find the book to purchase it if they're interested.
Thank you.
But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Professor Romanis, and taking my questions and giving your thoughtful responses. It's been really great having you.
No, thank you so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate the questions and how much energy you've put into reading my book and engaging with it. It's been amazing.